A 16-year-old girl from Denver, Colorado, began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own during ordinary family conversations at home. What started as what her parents thought was typical teenage behavior quickly escalated into something far more disturbing. Detailed conversations about places she'd never been and people she'd never met, all spoken in the distinct voice of an adult woman. But when a psychiatrist analyzed the audio recordings and made a shocking discovery about the voice's true identity, it would uncover a family secret that had been buried for decades. The first time Carol Miller heard her daughter Sarah speak in another woman's voice, she was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes on a Tuesday evening in late September. The autumn air had just begun to carry that crisp edge that promised winter wasn't far behind, and through the open window above the sink, she could hear the neighbor's dog barking at something in their yard. "Mom, you really ought to check on Mrs. Henderson next door," came Sarah's voice from behind her. "That woman's been having trouble with her hip again, and she's too proud to ask for help." Carol turned around, dish towel in hand, expecting to see her 16-year-old daughter standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. Sarah was there, all right, leaning casually against the doorframe with her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing her favorite oversized sweater. But something was off. "What did you say, honey?" Carol asked, though she'd heard every word clearly. "I said you should check on Mrs. Henderson," Sarah repeated, but now her voice was back to normal, that familiar teenage cadence Carol had grown so accustomed to over the years. "She's been limping around her yard all week." Carol blinked. For just a moment when Sarah had first spoken, her voice had sounded different. Older, more mature. There had been a slight accent to it too, something Carol couldn't quite place. Not Southern exactly, but definitely not the neutral Colorado pronunciation Sarah had grown up with. "How do you know about Mrs. Henderson's hip?" Carol asked. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know, I just noticed, I guess. She's been moving slower lately." That evening, Carol mentioned the incident to her husband David when he came home from his job at the engineering firm downtown. They were sitting on their back porch, watching the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, each nursing a beer. "You're probably just tired," David said reasonably, setting his bottle down on the small table between their chairs. Sarah's always been observant about the neighbors. Remember when she was 12 and noticed Mr. Garcia's newspapers were piling up before anyone else realized he'd had that stroke? Carol nodded, but something nagged at her. It wasn't just what Sarah had said about Mrs. Henderson. It was how she'd said it. The voice had been so distinctly different, so much more adult than Sarah's usual speech patterns. "Maybe you're right," she conceded, though privately she wasn't convinced. 3 days later, it happened again. This time, the whole family was gathered around the dinner table. David was describing a frustrating day at work, involving a client who kept changing the specifications for a bridge design, while Sarah picked at her chicken and vegetables with the kind of disinterest only teenagers could master. "You know," Sarah said suddenly, interrupting her father mid-sentence, "back in Traverse City, we had a contractor who pulled that same nonsense. Changed his mind 3 times about the width of the main span before we finally told him to take his business elsewhere." The silence that followed was deafening. David's fork was halfway to his mouth, frozen in mid-air. Carol felt that same chill she'd experienced in the kitchen a few days earlier. "What did you just say?" David asked carefully. Sarah looked up from her plate, her expression genuinely confused. "I said the chicken is really good, Mom. Did you use that new seasoning?" "No, before that," Carol pressed. "You said something about Traverse City, about a contractor." "I did?" Sarah's brow furrowed. "I don't remember saying anything about—" "Where's Traverse City?" "Michigan," David said slowly. "It's in Michigan, Sarah. Why would you mention it?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, and her confusion seemed genuine. "I've never been to Michigan. Why would I talk about some place I've never been?" Carol and David exchanged glances across the table. Their daughter's voice when she'd mentioned Traverse City had been completely different from her normal speaking voice. It had been lower, more confident, with that same slight accent Carol had noticed before. And Sarah genuinely didn't seem to remember saying it. "Maybe you heard it on TV or something," David suggested weakly. "Yeah, maybe," Sarah agreed, but she looked troubled. Over the next 2 weeks, the incidents became more frequent and more detailed. Sarah would suddenly speak in this other voice about places she'd never been, people she'd never met, and experiences she'd never had. She would mention a bakery on Cherry Street that made the best apple turnovers in town, though their Denver neighborhood had no Cherry Street and Sarah rarely ate pastries. She would reference driving a blue Chevrolet Nova to work every morning, despite the fact that Sarah didn't even have her driver's license yet. Each time when Carol or David asked her about what she'd said, Sarah would look blank and confused. It was as if she had no memory of speaking in the other voice at all. The voice always belonged to the same person, Carol realized. It was consistently the same tone, the same accent, the same speech patterns. It was as if another woman was occasionally borrowing Sarah's vocal cords. "We need to do something about this," Carol said to David one evening after Sarah had gone upstairs to finish her homework. They were standing in their bedroom, speaking in hushed tones so Sarah wouldn't overhear. "Like what?" David asked. "Take her to a doctor and tell them our daughter is speaking in someone else's voice? They'll think we're crazy." "Maybe we are crazy," Carol admitted. "But David, this isn't normal teenage behavior. This is something else entirely." David sat down heavily on the edge of their bed. "You think she's having some kind of breakdown? Psychological problems?" "I don't know what to think," Carol said, "but I'm scared. The voice is so real, so detailed. She talks about things like she actually lived them." That weekend, Sarah had what Carol would later describe as the most disturbing episode yet. They were all in the living room, watching a movie together, when Sarah suddenly sat up straight and looked directly at Carol. "You know, Carol," she said in that other woman's voice, "you remind me so much of my sister Ruth. Same kind eyes, same way of worrying about everyone else before yourself." The use of Carol's name, spoken in such a familiar, intimate way by this voice coming from her daughter's mouth, made Carol's blood run cold. "Sarah," Carol whispered. But Sarah was staring blankly at the television screen as if she hadn't spoken at all. When Carol said her name again, Sarah turned with a normal expression. "What's wrong, Mum? You look like you've seen a ghost." David reached for the remote and paused the movie. "Sarah, do you remember what you just said to your mother?" "I didn't say anything," Sarah replied. "I was watching the movie." "You called her by her name," David pressed. "You said she reminded you of your sister Ruth." Sarah's face went pale. "I don't have a sister named Ruth. And of course I call Mom by her name sometimes. What's the big deal?" But Carol could see the fear creeping into her daughter's eyes. Sarah might not remember the episodes, but she was starting to sense that something was wrong. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Carol and David made a decision that would change everything. "We're calling Dr. Morrison in the morning," David said, referring to their family physician. "And we're going to ask for a referral to someone who specializes in whatever this is." Carol nodded, though part of her wondered what kind of specialist dealt with teenagers who spoke in the voices of people they'd never met, about places they'd never been, with memories that weren't their own. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Carol found herself thinking about the name Ruth. In all the years she'd known David's family, she'd never heard mention of anyone named Ruth. But there had been something about the way the voice had said it, with such familiarity, such affection, that made it seem impossibly real. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Carol held her breath, listening, but all she could hear was the steady rhythm of David's breathing beside her and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Tomorrow, she told herself, they would find answers. Tomorrow, they would figure out what was happening to their daughter. But as Carol finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something much bigger than a simple psychological issue. The voice that had been coming from Sarah was too real, too detailed, too specific to be the product of teenage imagination or stress. And deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Carol was beginning to suspect that the voice belonged to someone who had once been very real indeed. The next morning would bring phone calls to doctors, appointments with specialists, and the beginning of a journey that would ultimately reveal a family secret that had been buried for over 40 years. But for now, in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, Carol Miller could only lie awake and wonder whose voice was living inside her daughter. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds had been practicing psychiatry for 15 years, specializing in dissociative disorders and trauma-related conditions. Her office on the 3rd floor of the University of Colorado Hospital was deliberately designed to feel more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space. Soft lighting, earth-tone furniture, and carefully chosen artwork created an atmosphere where patients could feel safe enough to share their deepest concerns. When Carol Miller called on a Monday morning in early October, describing her daughter's episodes in a voice that trembled with barely controlled anxiety, Dr. Reynolds initially suspected they were dealing with a case of dissociative identity disorder, or perhaps severe psychological stress manifesting in unusual ways. "She speaks as if she's someone else entirely," Carol explained during that first phone call. "Not just pretending or acting out, but with complete conviction about places and people we've never heard of. And afterward, she has no memory of it at all." Dr. Reynolds had heard similar descriptions before. Teenage years were particularly vulnerable times for the emergence of dissociative symptoms, often triggered by trauma, extreme stress, or unresolved family issues. What made the Miller case intriguing, however, was the consistency Carol described in the alternate voice. "It's always the same person," Carol had emphasized. "The same voice, the same accent, the same way of speaking, and the details are so specific, so vivid." She talks about driving a particular car, working at specific places, knowing particular people by name. Dr. Reynolds scheduled the first appointment for the following Thursday afternoon. She always preferred to meet with the entire family initially, to observe the dynamics and get a complete picture of how the symptoms were affecting everyone involved. The Miller family arrived precisely on time. David Miller was a tall, lean man in his mid-40s with graying temples and the kind of quiet composure that suggested he was used to solving problems methodically. Carol was shorter, with shoulder-length brown hair and worried eyes that darted frequently to her daughter. And Sarah herself was exactly what Dr. Reynolds expected of a 16-year-old dealing with something she couldn't understand. Anxious, slightly defiant, and clearly exhausted. "I want to start by saying that this is a safe space," Dr. Reynolds began once they were all settled in her office. "Sarah, nothing you say or do here will be judged or criticized. We're all here because we care about you and want to understand what's been happening." Sarah nodded but remained silent, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "Can you tell me, in your own words, what you've been experiencing?" Dr. Reynolds asked gently. "I don't really experience anything," Sarah said finally. "That's the weird part. My parents say I've been talking in some other woman's voice, but I don't remember any of it. It's like they're describing someone else entirely." "What's the last thing you remember before these episodes occur?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Usually I'm just sitting there listening to Mom and Dad talk, or we're watching TV or eating dinner. Normal stuff. And then suddenly they're staring at me like I grew a second head, asking me about things I never said." Dr. Reynolds made notes while Sarah spoke, observing her body language and speech patterns. The teenager seemed genuinely confused and somewhat frightened by what was happening to her. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, can you describe what you observed during these episodes?" David and Carol exchanged glances before David spoke. It's not just that her voice changes, her whole demeanor shifts. She sits differently, speaks with more confidence, uses phrases and expressions that don't sound like Sarah at all. "And the voice has an accent," Carol added. "Something vaguely Midwestern, maybe. It's subtle, but definitely there. Can you give me an example of the types of things she says?" Carol pulled out a small notebook from her purse. Dr. Reynolds noticed that her hands were shaking slightly. "I started writing them down after the first few times. She's mentioned working at a place called Peterson's Hardware, driving a blue Chevrolet Nova, living on Cherry Street, and having a sister named Ruth. She talks about going to church at St. Mary's and buying groceries at Kowalski's Market. These are all very specific details," Dr. Reynolds observed. "Do any of these places or names mean anything to your family?" "Nothing," David said firmly. "We've lived in Denver since before Sarah was born. We don't know anyone named Ruth, and we've never heard of any of those businesses." Dr. Reynolds turned back to Sarah. "How do you feel when your parents tell you about these episodes?" "Scared," Sarah admitted quietly, "and confused. It's like they're describing a completely different person, but they swear it's me. I keep trying to remember saying those things, but there's just nothing. It's like those moments don't exist in my head." During that first session, no episode occurred. Dr. Reynolds spent the remainder of the time gathering family history, looking for potential trauma or stressors that might explain Sarah's condition. The Millers seemed like a stable, loving family with no history of abuse or major psychological issues. "I'd like to see Sarah alone for our next session," Dr. Reynolds said as they prepared to leave, "and I'm going to give you a small digital recorder. If Sarah has any episodes at home, I want you to record them. The more information we can gather, the better I can help." Carol clutched the small device like a lifeline. "You think you can help her?" "I believe we can figure out what's happening," Dr. Reynolds said carefully. "These types of dissociative symptoms often respond well to treatment once we understand their underlying cause." But privately, Dr. Reynolds was intrigued by the consistency and specificity of the details Carol had described. Most dissociative episodes she'd encountered were more fragmented, less coherent. The level of detail the Millers described suggested something more complex than typical teenage stress responses. 3 days after that first session, Carol called Dr. Reynolds' emergency line. "It happened again," Carol said, her voice tight with anxiety. "And this time it was different, more intense. She spoke for almost 10 minutes straight, and I recorded it all." "Can you bring the recording to our session tomorrow?" Dr. Reynolds asked. "Dr. Reynolds," Carol said, lowering her voice. She knew things, specific things about people and places that felt too real to be made up. She talked about a fire at some lumber mill, about helping serve food at a church supper, about her friend Mary getting engaged to a man named Frank. The details were so vivid, so precise. The next afternoon, Sarah arrived for her individual session looking pale and exhausted. She'd had another episode the previous evening and was beginning to show signs of genuine distress about her condition. "I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my mind," Sarah confessed once they were alone. "My parents keep telling me about these conversations I supposedly had, but it's like they're talking about someone else's life. How can I not remember entire conversations?" "That must be very frightening," Dr. Reynolds said sympathetically. "Let's listen to the recording your mother made and see if it triggers any memories for you." Dr. Reynolds set up the small digital recorder on the coffee table between them. When she pressed play, Sarah's familiar teenage voice filled the room, but speaking in a way that was completely unlike the young woman sitting across from her. "Well, I tell you what," the voice on the recording said, "that fire at Miller's lumber mill was the worst thing this town had seen in decades. Poor old Chester Miller lost everything he'd worked for his whole life. But you know how folks are around here. Everyone pitched in to help his family get back on their feet. Mary organized a bake sale, and Frank donated lumber from his family's lot, even though they were competitors." Dr. Reynolds watched Sarah's face as the recording played. The teenager's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror as she listened to her own voice describing events and people she had never known. "The church supper last Sunday was quite a success too," the voice continued. "We raised almost $300 for the Peterson family after Jim lost his job at the plant. Ruth made her famous apple turnovers, sold every last one of them. That sister of mine could always bake better than anyone else in town." Sarah was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "That's not me," she whispered. "That voice, those words, that's not me talking." Dr. Reynolds stopped the recording. "Do you remember any of this conversation?" "No," Sarah said, shaking her head vehemently. "I don't remember saying any of those things. I don't know who Chester Miller is, or Mary, or Frank, or Ruth. I've never been to a church supper in my life." "But it is your voice," Dr. Reynolds said gently. "How is that possible?" Sarah's voice cracked. "How can I be saying things I don't remember about people I don't know in a voice that doesn't sound like me?" Dr. Reynolds had been wondering the same thing. The voice on the recording was undeniably Sarah's, but the speech patterns, the accent, the confident way of speaking, it was like listening to a completely different person using Sarah's vocal cords. After Sarah left that afternoon, Dr. Reynolds sat alone in her office, replaying portions of the recording. Something about the details nagged at her. The specificity was remarkable. Names, businesses, events that were described with the kind of casual familiarity that suggested genuine lived experience. On an impulse, she opened her laptop and began searching for some of the names and places mentioned in the recording. Miller's lumber mill brought up several results across various small towns in the Midwest. When she added fire to the search terms, she found a newspaper article from the Traverse City Record-Eagle, dated August 15, 1977. "Local lumber mill destroyed in weekend fire," the headline read. The article described how Miller's lumber mill, owned by Chester Miller, had been completely destroyed in an electrical fire. The community had rallied to support the Miller family, with local businesses and churches organizing fundraising efforts. Dr. Reynolds stared at her computer screen, feeling a chill run down her spine. The fire Sarah's alternate voice had described had actually happened, in Traverse City, Michigan, 42 years ago. She continued searching, her heart rate increasing with each confirmed detail. Peterson's Hardware had indeed existed in Traverse City in the 1970s. St. Mary's Catholic Church was still there. Kowalski's Market had been a family-owned grocery store that operated until 1983. But it was the obituary she found that made her hands shake as she reached for her phone to call the Miller family. Margaret Louise Hendricks, 34, died Tuesday, November 8, 1978, in a single-car accident on Highway 37 outside Traverse City. Margaret was a beloved member of St. Mary's Catholic Church and worked at Peterson's Hardware for 8 years. She is survived by her sister, Ruth Hendricks of Traverse City, and numerous friends and colleagues who will remember her generous spirit and infectious laugh. The obituary included a photograph, a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing next to a blue Chevrolet Nova. Dr. Reynolds sat back in her chair trying to process what she had discovered. Either this was the most elaborate and impossible coincidence she had ever encountered, or Sarah Miller was somehow channeling the memories and personality of a woman who had died 23 years before Sarah was even born. As a scientist and a medical professional, Dr. Reynolds knew there had to be a rational explanation. But as she stared at Margaret Hendricks' photograph and listened again to the recording of Sarah's voice describing Margaret's life with perfect accuracy, she began to question everything she thought she knew about the human mind. The next morning, she would begin the most challenging investigation of her career, one that would force her to consider possibilities that challenged the very foundations of modern psychiatry. Dr. Jennifer Reynolds had barely slept since discovering Margaret Hendricks' obituary. She'd spent the entire weekend researching everything she could find about the woman whose voice seemed to be speaking through Sarah Miller. What she'd uncovered only deepened the mystery and challenged everything she understood about human psychology. Margaret Hendricks had lived exactly the life that Sarah's alternate voice described. Born in 1944 in Traverse City, Michigan, she had worked at Peterson's Hardware from 1970 until her death in 1978. She had indeed driven a blue 1969 Chevrolet Nova, belonged to St. Mary's Catholic Church, and had a sister named Ruth who still lived in the area. Dr. Reynolds had even found archived local newspaper articles mentioning Margaret's involvement in church fundraisers and community events, details that matched perfectly with what Sarah had described during her episodes. But the most unsettling discovery came when Dr. Reynolds found Margaret's employment records through a contact at the Michigan State Archives. Margaret had lived at 247 Cherry Street, the exact address Sarah's voice had mentioned as home. On Monday morning, Dr. Reynolds made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She called Dr. Marcus Webb, a forensic audio specialist she'd worked with on several legal cases involving voice identification and audio evidence analysis. "Marcus, I need a favor," she said when he answered his phone. "I have some audio recordings that I need analyzed, and I need complete discretion." "What kind of analysis are we talking about?" Dr. Webb asked. His laboratory was located in downtown Denver, equipped with the most sophisticated audio analysis equipment available. "Voice pattern analysis, speech rhythm, accent identification, everything you can tell me about the speaker," Dr. Reynolds said. "But Marcus, this case is unusual. I can't explain the details over the phone, but I need you to approach this with a completely open mind." Dr. Webb had worked with Dr. Reynolds enough times to trust her judgment, even when she was being cryptic. "Bring me the recordings this afternoon. I'll clear my schedule." Dr. Reynolds spent the morning preparing. She had 3 recordings now. The original one Carol had made, plus 2 more from episodes that had occurred over the weekend. Each one featured Sarah's voice speaking as Margaret, discussing various aspects of life in 1970s Traverse City with increasing detail and emotional depth. In the most recent recording made Sunday evening, Margaret's voice had become almost melancholy as she spoke about missing her job at the hardware store and worrying about Ruth, who had been struggling with health problems. The emotional authenticity was what disturbed Dr. Reynolds most. This wasn't the kind of performance a teenager could maintain, especially one who had no conscious memory of speaking. That afternoon, Dr. Reynolds sat in Dr. Webb's laboratory, watching him set up the audio analysis equipment. The lab was a maze of computers, speakers, and electronic devices that could break down sound in ways that revealed details imperceptible to the human ear. "Before I start," Dr. Webb said, adjusting his glasses as he prepared the first recording, "do you want to tell me what I'm looking for specifically?" "I need you to analyze these recordings as if they were evidence in a legal case," Dr. Reynolds said. "I need to know if the same person is speaking in all of them. What you can tell me about their background, age, regional accent, everything your equipment can reveal." Dr. Webb nodded and began the first analysis. The recording of Sarah's normal speaking voice filled the lab's high-quality speakers as complex waveforms appeared on multiple computer monitors. "This is your baseline," Dr. Webb explained, pointing to the patterns on his screen. "Female, approximately 16 years old, general American accent with slight Western influence, probably Colorado or nearby, normal speech patterns for her age group." Then he played the first recording of Margaret's voice speaking through Sarah. The change was immediately visible on the monitors. The waveforms shifted dramatically, showing different patterns in pitch, rhythm, and vocal resonance. "Interesting," Dr. Webb murmured, leaning closer to his screens. "This is definitely the same vocal apparatus, same throat, same mouth, same physical voice, but the patterns are completely different." "How different?" Dr. Reynolds asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "It's like watching two completely different people use the same instrument," Dr. Webb said, running the audio through additional filters. "The baseline recording shows typical teenage speech patterns: faster pace, rising intonation at the end of statements, informal grammar structure. But this second voice—" He paused the recording and pointed to specific areas on his computer screen. "This second voice shows speech patterns consistent with someone significantly older. The rhythm is more measured, the grammar structure more formal, and there's definitely a regional accent here." "What kind of regional accent?" Dr. Webb ran the audio through a specialized program that compared speech patterns against a database of regional American dialects. After several minutes, results began appearing on his screen. "Upper Midwest," he said with certainty. "Specifically, the Great Lakes region. Northern Michigan would be my best guess, with influences that suggest the speaker lived there for most of their adult life." Dr. Reynolds felt her stomach tighten. "How confident are you about that assessment?" "Very confident. The vowel patterns, the way certain consonants are pronounced, the rhythm and cadence, and it's a textbook example of Northern Michigan dialect from, I'd say, the 1960s and 70s based on some of the linguistic patterns." Dr. Webb played the second recording, which contained an even longer episode of Margaret's voice. As the analysis ran, he became increasingly focused on his screens, occasionally stopping the playback to examine specific sections in greater detail. "Jennifer," he said finally, turning to face her with a puzzled expression, "I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen anything quite like this." "What do you mean?" "These recordings were made of the same person. There's no question about that. The physical voice patterns match perfectly, but the speech characteristics are so different that if I didn't know better, I'd swear I was listening to two completely different people." Dr. Webb pulled up a comparison chart on his largest monitor. "Look at this. The baseline recording shows speech patterns typical of a contemporary American teenager, but these other recordings show patterns consistent with an adult who lived decades ago. The vocabulary, the grammar structure, even the way emotions are expressed, it's like listening to someone from a different generation entirely." "Is it possible for someone to fake these kinds of speech patterns?" Dr. Reynolds asked. "To this degree of accuracy and consistency? Highly unlikely. You'd need extensive training in linguistics and dialect coaching, plus you'd have to maintain the performance unconsciously, including micro-expressions in speech that most people aren't even aware of." Dr. Webb ran one more test, analyzing the emotional resonance and stress patterns in Margaret's voice. "There's something else," he said, studying the results. "The emotional authenticity in these recordings is remarkable. When this voice talks about personal experiences, missing work, worrying about family, the vocal stress patterns indicate genuine emotional response, not performance or acting." Dr. Reynolds stared at the waveforms on the screen, each peak and valley representing something that challenged her understanding of human psychology. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need your complete honesty. Based on your analysis, is there any conventional explanation for what we're hearing? Doctor. Webb was quiet for a long moment, looking at his data one more time. Scientifically speaking, no, he said finally. If I had to write a report on these recordings for a legal case, I would have to conclude that we have two distinct personalities speaking through the same physical voice. The differences are too consistent, too deep and too authentic to be explained by conscious performance or psychological role-playing. That evening, Dr. Reynolds sat alone in her office, staring at Dr. Webb's analysis report. The technical language couldn't disguise the impossibility of what the data revealed. According to the most sophisticated audio analysis available, Sarah Miller was somehow speaking with the authentic voice patterns, accent, and emotional responses of a woman who had died when Sarah's parents were still children. She picked up her phone and called Carol Miller. "Mrs. Miller, I need to ask you some questions about your family history," Dr. Reynolds said when Carol answered. "Of course, has the analysis helped?" "It's raised more questions than it's answered," Dr. Reynolds admitted. "I need to know if your family has any connection to Michigan, specifically the Traverse City area." "Michigan?" Carol sounded surprised. "No, not that I know of. David's family is from Texas originally, and mine is from Oregon." "Why would you ask about Michigan? What about extended family, grandparents, great-grandparents, distant relatives?" Carol was quiet for a moment. "Well, David's grandmother lived in Michigan for a while, I think, but that was long before David was born. She moved to Texas in the 1940s and never went back." Dr. Reynolds felt a spark of possibility. "Do you know anything specific about her time in Michigan?" "Not really. She died when David was young, and she didn't talk much about her life before Texas. David's father might know more, but he passed away 5 years ago." "What was her name?" Agnes Kowalski, I think. She married David's grandfather and became Agnes Miller." Dr. Reynolds nearly dropped the phone. Kowalski's Market, the grocery store Margaret's voice had mentioned multiple times, had been owned by the Kowalski family. "Mrs. Miller, I need you and your family to come in tomorrow morning, and I need you to bring any family documents, photographs, or records you might have, especially anything related to David's grandmother." "Dr. Reynolds, you're scaring me. What did you find?" "I'm not sure yet," Dr. Reynolds said honestly, "but I think we're getting close to understanding what's happening to Sarah." After ending the call, Dr. Reynolds returned to her computer and began searching for more information about the Kowalski family in Traverse City. What she found sent chills down her spine. Agnes Kowalski had indeed lived in Traverse City until 1943, when she married Robert Miller and moved to Texas. But more importantly, Agnes had a sister named Mary Kowalski, who had married a man named Frank Hendricks in 1942. Frank and Mary Hendricks had 2 daughters, Ruth, born in 1946, and Margaret, born in 1944. Dr. Reynolds stared at her computer screen, the pieces of an impossible puzzle falling into place. Margaret Hendricks, the woman whose voice was speaking through Sarah Miller, had been Sarah's great-great-aunt. Agnes Kowalski Miller, David's grandmother, had been Margaret's aunt. But that still didn't explain how Sarah could have access to Margaret's memories, her speech patterns, her intimate knowledge of people and events from decades before Sarah was born. Agnes had left Michigan in 1943, a year before Margaret was born. There should have been no connection between them. Dr. Reynolds spent the rest of the evening researching everything she could find about the Hendricks and Kowalski families. She discovered that Agnes had maintained correspondence with her Michigan relatives for many years after moving to Texas. There were records of visits, letters, and even some photographs in the Traverse City Historical Society's archives. But the most significant discovery came in a 1979 newspaper article about Margaret Hendricks' funeral. Among the out-of-state attendees listed was Mrs. Agnes Miller of Austin, Texas, representing the Kowalski family. Agnes had attended Margaret's funeral. She had known Margaret personally, had maintained a relationship with her Michigan family across decades and distance. As Dr. Reynolds prepared to leave her office that night, she found herself facing a question that challenged everything she believed about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human identity. If family connections could somehow preserve memories across generations, if the voices of the dead could speak through the living, then what did that mean for everything she thought she understood about the human mind? Tomorrow, She would have to help the Miller family understand that their daughter wasn't suffering from a psychological disorder. She was somehow channeling the authentic voice and memories of a family member who had died 17 years before Sarah was born. And Dr. Reynolds still had no idea how that was possible or what it meant for Sarah's future. The digital recorder sat on her desk, containing hours of Margaret Hendricks' voice speaking through Sarah Miller about a life that had ended decades ago. As Dr. Reynolds finally turned off the lights and locked her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case would change not only how she understood her profession, but how she understood the very nature of human consciousness itself. The evidence was undeniable. The audio analysis had confirmed what seemed impossible, and tomorrow she would have to find a way to explain to a terrified family that their teenage daughter had become a bridge between the present and a past that should have been buried forever. The Miller family arrived at Dr. Reynolds' office Tuesday morning, carrying a cardboard box that would change everything they thought they knew about their family history. Carol clutched it protectively, while David looked like a man preparing for bad news, and Sarah sat quietly between them, exhausted from another episode the previous evening. "Before we discuss what I've discovered," Dr. Reynolds began carefully, "I need you to understand that what we're dealing with goes beyond conventional psychology. The audio analysis has confirmed something remarkable, and I believe the answers lie in your family's past." She had spent most of the night deciding how to present her findings without sounding like she'd lost her professional objectivity. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications challenged everything she'd been trained to believe about human consciousness and memory. "What kind of answers?" David asked, his engineer's mind clearly struggling with the mysterious nature of his daughter's condition. "I've discovered that the voice speaking through Sarah belongs to someone who was actually related to your family," Dr. Reynolds said. "Margaret Hendricks was your great-aunt, David, your grandmother, Agnes Kowalski's niece." The silence that followed was deafening. Carol's mouth fell open, and David stared at Dr. Reynolds as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "That's impossible," David said finally. "My grandmother never mentioned having a niece named Margaret. She rarely talked about her family in Michigan at all." "That's what we need to explore," Dr. Reynolds said gently. "What did you bring with you today?" Carol set the cardboard box on the coffee table with trembling hands. "These are all the things we found in your grandmother's belongings after she died," she told David. "Your father stored them in the attic and never looked through them. We were going to sort through everything someday, but we never got around to it," David finished, looking at the box as if it contained something dangerous. Dr. Reynolds helped them open the box, and immediately they could see it contained decades of memories. There were photographs, letters, documents, and what appeared to be several small cassette tapes wrapped in rubber bands. "Let's start with the photographs," Dr. Reynolds suggested. The first few pictures were typical family photos from the 1940s and 50s. Agnes as a young bride, early photos of David's father as a child, holiday gatherings in Texas. But as they dug deeper, they found older photographs, some dating back to the 1930s and earlier. "Look at this," Carol said, pulling out a black and white photograph that showed a group of people standing in front of a house. Written on the back in faded ink was Kowalski Family Reunion, Traverse City, 1965. Dr. Reynolds examined the photo carefully. Among the faces, she could see a woman who looked remarkably like the obituary photo of Margaret Hendricks, standing next to an older woman who bore a strong resemblance to other photos of Agnes. "That's your grandmother," Dr. Reynolds said, pointing to Agnes in the photo, "and I believe this woman next to her is Margaret." David took the photograph, studying it intently. "I've never seen this picture before. Grandma never told us about any family reunions." They continued searching through the photographs, finding several more that included Margaret. In one particularly clear photo from 1967, Margaret was standing next to the blue Chevrolet Nova that had been mentioned in Sarah's episodes, smiling broadly with her arm around Ruth. But it was Carol who made the discovery that would unlock the entire mystery. "What are these?" she asked, holding up the cassette tapes they'd found at the bottom of the box. There were 6 tapes in total, each labeled in Agnes's handwriting with dates ranging from 1970 to 1978. The labels read, "Letter from Margaret, Christmas 1970, Margaret's wedding news, June 1972, Margaret and Ruth visit, August 1974, and so on. Dr. Reynolds felt her pulse quicken. These appear to be audio letters. Before affordable long-distance calling, many families would send cassette tapes back and forth to stay in touch. "You mean my grandmother and Margaret sent voice recordings to each other?" David asked. "It looks that way." This was fairly common in the 1970s, especially for families separated by long distances. Sarah, who had been silent throughout the discovery process, suddenly looked up. "Can we listen to them?" "Doctor." Reynolds had brought a portable cassette player, anticipating they might find audio materials. With the family's permission, she inserted the oldest tape and pressed play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakably Margaret Hendricks, speaking with the same accent and speech patterns they'd heard coming from Sarah during her episodes. "Hi, Aunt Agnes, it's Margaret. I hope this letter finds you and Uncle Robert doing well. Things here in Traverse City are good. I got that promotion at Peterson's Hardware I wrote to you about, so now I'm managing the whole paint department. Ruth is doing fine too, though she's been complaining about her hip again." Sarah gasped, her face going pale. "That's the voice. That's exactly the voice that comes out of me." They listened to several minutes of Margaret's recording, during which she described her daily life, her work at the hardware store, her concerns about Ruth's health, and her social activities at church. Every detail matched perfectly with what Sarah had described during her episodes. "This is incredible," Carol whispered. "She's talking about all the same things, the same people, the same places." Dr. Reynolds paused the tape. "Let's listen to more of them. I have a theory about what's happening, but I need to understand the full scope of these recordings." Over the next hour, they listened to portions of all 6 tapes. The recordings spanned 8 years of Margaret's life, from her daily routines to major events like the lumber mill fire, church fundraisers, and family gatherings. Margaret's voice was warm and conversational as she shared intimate details of her life with the aunt who had moved so far away. In the final recording, dated just 2 months before Margaret's death, her voice carried a note of melancholy. "I've been thinking a lot about family lately, Aunt Agnes, about how important it is to stay connected, to remember where we come from. I know I won't live forever, and sometimes I worry that all these stories, all these memories of our little town and our family will just disappear when I'm gone. I wish there was a way to make sure they don't get lost." The tape ended abruptly and the room fell silent. Dr. Reynolds turned to face the family. "I believe I understand what's happening to Sarah now. These recordings provide the missing piece of the puzzle." "How?" David asked. "How can listening to old tapes explain why Sarah speaks in Margaret's voice?" "Let me ask you something first," Dr. Reynolds said. "After your grandmother died, what happened to her belongings?" "We stored most of them at our house," Carol said. "The furniture went to relatives, but personal items like this box have been in our attic for 15 years, including these tapes. Everything was boxed up together. We never sorted through any of it." Dr. Reynolds nodded. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Have you ever been in your parents' attic?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Sometimes. Not often, but yeah, sometimes I go up there." "When did you start going up there?" "I don't know. Maybe when I was 10 or 11, I liked exploring, looking at old stuff." "Have you ever seen this box before?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so. I remember seeing boxes with Grandma's stuff in them." "Did you ever open any of the boxes?" Sarah looked at her parents nervously. "I wasn't supposed to, but yeah, sometimes. I was curious about Grandma since she died before I could really know her." Carol and David exchanged glances. They had never explicitly forbidden Sarah from exploring the attic, but they had assumed she would leave the stored belongings alone. "Sarah?" Doctor Reynolds continued gently. "Do you remember ever finding these cassette tapes?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Maybe. There's an old stereo up there from like the 80s. Sometimes I would listen to music on it when I was up there." "Do you remember listening to any tapes that weren't music?" "I don't know," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her voice. "Maybe. It was years ago and I wasn't really paying attention. I was just a kid messing around." Dr. Reynolds leaned forward. "Sarah, I believe that over the years you've been unconsciously absorbing Margaret's voice and memories from these recordings. Children are remarkably good at absorbing speech patterns and information, even when they're not consciously trying to learn." "You're saying I learned to talk like her from old tapes?" Sarah asked incredulously. "More than that. I think you internalized not just her voice, but her memories, her experiences, her entire way of speaking and thinking about the world. These tapes contain hundreds of hours of Margaret's most intimate thoughts and detailed descriptions of her life. David was shaking his head. But that still doesn't explain the episodes. If Sarah learned this stuff years ago, why is it only coming out now? Adolescence, Dr. Reynolds explained. The teenage brain goes through massive reorganization. Memories and information that have been dormant for years can suddenly surface, especially during times of stress or emotional development. Sarah's unconscious mind has been storing Margaret's voice and memories, and now they're finding expression. But why doesn't Sarah remember listening to the tapes? Carol asked. Because she was young, and she wasn't listening with the intent to memorize, but children's brains are incredibly absorbent. Sarah could have played these tapes dozens of times over the years, gradually absorbing every detail without conscious awareness. Dr. Reynolds pulled out her notes from the audio analysis. The forensic examination revealed that Sarah speaks in Margaret's voice with complete authenticity. The accent, the emotional patterns, even the cultural references from the 1970s. That level of authenticity can only come from extensive exposure to the original source. Sarah looked overwhelmed. So you're saying that woman's voice has been inside my head for years, and I didn't even know it? In a sense, yes. Margaret's recordings were like seeds planted in your unconscious mind. They've been growing there, and now they're flowering into these episodes where her voice and memories come through you. David struggled for words. That's actually possible? More possible than the alternatives we were considering, Dr. Reynolds said with a slight smile. The human brain's capacity for unconscious learning and memory storage is far greater than most people realize. Sarah has essentially become a living repository for Margaret's memories and experiences. Carol was studying the photographs they'd found, tears in her eyes. All these years we never knew about this part of the family. Margaret looks so much like Sarah. And David, you have the same eyes as your grandmother. There's something else, Dr. Reynolds said. Margaret's final recording suggests she was aware that her memories and stories were important. In a way, Sarah has fulfilled Margaret's wish that these memories wouldn't be lost. Sarah picked up one of the photographs showing Margaret standing beside her blue Nova. It's weird to look at her and know that somehow I know everything about her life. I can picture that car, that street, even though I've never been there. The episodes are essentially your unconscious mind accessing and expressing Margaret's stored memories, Dr. Reynolds explained. Your brain has been faithfully preserving not just her words, but her entire way of experiencing and describing the world. Over the next hour, they listened to more of the recordings and examined more photographs. Each tape revealed new details that Sarah had accurately described during her episodes. Margaret's stories about church suppers, her concerns about Ruth's health, her fondness for her job at the hardware store, even her memories of the lumber mill fire, all of it was preserved in her audio letters to Agnes. So, Sarah isn't sick? Carol asked hopefully. Sarah isn't suffering from a psychological disorder, Dr. Reynolds confirmed. What she's experiencing is actually a remarkable demonstration of the brain's capacity for unconscious learning and memory preservation. However, the episodes are distressing for her because she doesn't understand what's happening. Can it be stopped? Sarah asked. With therapy and understanding, yes. Now that we know the source of the episodes, we can work on helping you gain conscious control over when and how Margaret's memories surface. Think of it as learning to manage a very unique form of inherited memory. Dr. Reynolds spent the remainder of the session outlining a treatment plan that would help Sarah understand and control her connection to Margaret's memories. Rather than trying to suppress the episodes entirely, they would work on helping Sarah consciously access the memories when she chose to, while maintaining her own sense of identity and control. There's something beautiful about this, Carol said as they prepared to leave. It's like Margaret found a way to keep her stories alive through Sarah. Sarah looked thoughtful. Maybe that's why it doesn't feel scary when it happens. It feels familiar, like remembering something I'd forgotten. In a very real sense, you are remembering, Dr. Reynolds said. You're remembering Margaret's memories, preserved in your unconscious mind for all these years. As the Miller family left that day, carrying the box of rediscovered family history, Dr. Reynolds reflected on one of the most unusual cases of her career. What had initially appeared to be a severe psychological disorder had turned out to be something far more extraordinary. a demonstration of the human brain's incredible capacity for preserving and transmitting memory across generations. 3 months later, Sarah had learned to consciously access Margaret's memories without the frightening episodes of unconscious expression. She had become the family historian, able to share stories and details about their Michigan relatives that would have otherwise been lost forever. The Miller family had also reconnected with their Michigan relatives, including Ruth Hendricks, who was still alive at 93 and living in a nursing home in Traverse City. When they called to introduce themselves and explain their connection, Ruth wept with joy at hearing from Agnes's family after so many years. Margaret always said those tapes would be important someday, Ruth told them during their first phone conversation. She said our stories needed to be preserved, that someone in the family would need them eventually. Dr. Reynolds included the Miller case in a research paper about unconscious memory preservation and familial connections, though she was careful to protect the family's privacy. The case challenged conventional understanding about the limits of human memory and the ways family history could be preserved across generations. For Sarah, what had begun as a terrifying experience of losing control had transformed into a unique gift. She had become the keeper of Margaret Hendricks' memories, the bridge between past and present that allowed her family's history to live on. The cassette tapes now occupied a place of honor in the Miller home, no longer hidden away in dusty boxes, but carefully preserved as the family treasures they had always been. And sometimes, when Sarah chose to let Margaret's voice speak through her, it was no longer frightening or mysterious. It was simply family reaching across the years to remind them where they came from and who they were meant to be. Sarah Miller had discovered that voices from the past don't always haunt. Sometimes they heal. Sometimes they bring families together and preserve the stories that might otherwise be lost to time. And in Margaret Hendricks' case, her voice had found exactly the right person to carry her memories forward into the future, ensuring that her life, her stories, and her love for family would never truly be forgotten. Dr. Reynolds often thought about the case in the months that followed, marveling at the mysterious ways human consciousness could preserve and transmit the most important parts of who we are. Sarah Miller had shown her that the boundaries between past and present, between individual and family, were far more fluid than she had ever imagined. The voice that had once seemed so frightening had become a gift, one that connected Sarah not just to a great-great-aunt she had never met, but to the entire tapestry of family history that made her who she was. In the end, Margaret Hendricks had gotten her wish. Her stories hadn't been lost. They had found their way into the heart and mind of a young woman who would carry them forward, ensuring that the voices of the past would continue to speak to future generations. The mystery of Sarah's alternate voice had been solved, but its resolution had revealed something even more profound: the incredible power of family connections to transcend time, distance, and even death itself.